are we really the masters of our fate? The captains of our souls? Whether or not we have this free will, as it's often referred to, has been the subject of debates among philosophers, scientists, theologians, and more, at least since words have been written down, and most likely far before them. And folks, like many of the big questions we've explored, just like Sherry talked to about these children, there doesn't seem to be agreement on the answer, even in the 21st century. The possibilities seem to fall on a continuum, or perhaps it's more complicated than something linear, but for this sermon, we'll proceed as if that's the case. Most of our proceedings on any subject matter are done as if some assumptions are so, aren't they? I looked at several sources to examine this topic, including the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, that 20 questions book that's been on my bedside for months, another philosophy book, and internet sources, including Wikipedia, of course, and more. I'm not going to interrupt this sermon to share which source my information came from. That doesn't seem to help out in a sermon. It takes up a lot of time, but those are basically where I got my information. So here's a little of what folks, including me, have been thinking about this subject. According to David Hume, the question of the nature of free will is the most contentious question of metaphysics. If this is correct, then figuring out what free will is may be difficult. But basically, to say that humans have free will is to say that they have the capacity to choose their actions. Now, let me attempt to take you down this continuum road to free will. On the side furthest from free will is what many refer to as hard determinism or scientific determinism. The view that all events, including mental events, have a cause. Every event has some cause. In other words, all states of affairs, both physical and mental, are conditioned by their causes and are describable by scientific law. In a deterministic universe, there is no free will, no miracles, no chance events. The reason some refer to this as scientific determinism is that it seemed for a long time that science backed up this view. There was a cause for everything, even if we didn't understand it yet. And for things we still don't understand, well, maybe science hasn't figured that out yet. At one time, there were magical explanations, for example, for rainbows. But now we understand what causes them. Similarly, we know a lot more now about evolution and DNA, etc., than we used to know. Some of you are old enough to remember the twin studies done back in the 60s. They found these identical twins that had been separated at birth for adoption. They used to do that. We don't do that anymore, but they used to separate them to make two families happy, right? So they found these families and studied them as well as fraternal twins that were separated at birth, and found that the identical twins were significantly more likely to have made the same or similar life choices. Some of these twins got together after the study and they went on talk shows. Do any of you remember that? Like Johnny Carson or something, these twins that had not lived together forever were found together. I remember those things because it was very interesting. Some had actually married spouses with the same names. They smoked the same brand of cigarettes, etc. You know, that kind of thing. Same toothpaste. Of course, they emphasized how they were alike, not how they were different. But it did lead to some credence that perhaps we are hardwired to lean towards certain choices. Now, I wasn't here to hear James Woodall's message last week about hardwired to racism, but I gather from the description that our evolution is hardwired us towards having some prejudices or hardwired us towards some things like that. Of course, evolution has us hardwired though to eat lots of high calorie stuff, lots of sugar, because our hunter-gatherer ancestors had to get as many of those good calories as they could to survive. And the ones that liked that taste were more likely than the ones that survived. And so now that's why we're stuck with this, you know. I went to an event last night and I was not going to eat those sweets, but that piece of chocolate fudge or brownie, whatever it was, it just called out to me. So I ate it. I did. I did. But that doesn't mean we can't choose to do differently. At least I just ate one piece. Okay. We can choose to do differently. It's hard to turn down some of those things, but we can choose to do differently than ways that we may have been, that evolution has taught us to be. These deterministic causal views were also adopted by psychologists like B.F. Skinner, who saw all our behaviors as results of rewards and punishments. He could predict what those mice were going to do very well. But now there is a new science, quantum physics, which seems to weigh against determinism. And who knows what will be next. So let's continue on this road I have some. Also at the same end of that road is something called predeterminism. It's more of a theological viewpoint. On this doctrine, events throughout eternity are thought to have been foreordained by God or some other supernatural power, the stars, whatever, in a causal sequence. If they're lined up or Mercury's in retrograde or whatever, you know, okay? That's why. The metaphor of God constructing and winding up a clock, the universe, and letting it run to the end of time is often used. The design is there, it's turned on, but is thought. Moving on down the road, we come to soft determinism. This is the philosophical view that all physical events are caused, but mental processes are uncaused. Choices have only to do with the mental processes and have no actual effect in the external world. On this view, what we can control is not what happens in the world, but how we think about it, what happens in the world. Our choices are restricted to willing the next moment in spite of its inevitability. We might still hope for it, or simply to be willing to let it be. Let it be, let it be. I have some folks share with me that things that have happened were meant to be. And I just have to think more positively about it. A little further down the road is fatalism. The big things, they say, like birth and death, are determined. There is a time that you are going to die. But some choice still exists. Here's a quote from one of the internet encyclopedias that provides a good example. I'll read this for you. Suppose, for example, by means of some kind of revelation, I learn that I will die from burns at 10:02 a.m. in the local Mercy Hospital on Saturday morning. On the one hand, suppose as soon as I learn this, I get in my car to get to the airport and get as far away from possible. But on the way to the airport, my car is hit by a tanker and I suffer intense heat. After being transported to the hospital, I linger on for a while and then I die at the appropriated time. On the other hand, suppose I did not take the risk of traveling to the airport and go home and intend to stay under my bed until Sunday. Unknown to me, however, there was a wiring fault in the house and the house catches on fire and so on. I would have choices in the situation, but the fatal event, the big event, was going to occur anyway. Another kind of determinism along this road that does include free will is predestination. Many persons who hold this doctrine think it is compatible with free will in the sense that God knows in advance what will happen, but we freely choose. And by coincidence, We choose according to God's plan. Then we come to indeterminism. This is the philosophical doctrine that denies that determinism is true. More specifically, they say not all events, either mental or physical, are determined by past events. There is a certain amount of free play between events, possibly due to chance, free choice, or chaos. Some events are caused, and some events are not. We've not made it all the way to free will yet, folks. Next on this imaginary roadway is chance, like tossing a coin, which some say can be predicted to some degree of accuracy by mathematical calculation. But for the most part, it's that part of life where most of us say, it happens. Then at last, we make it to the philosophical and sometimes theological view of free will. The doctrine that some of our choices are uncaused. Free will results from the absence of causes, conditions, or other necessary determinations of choice or behavior. Now, most of us who proclaim free will do acknowledge limitations. We know there are limitations of our will and choices. That song we sang about, I wish I was a bird, you know. Well, I cannot flap my arms like a bird flaps its wings and fly. I am bound by the laws of nature. However, some folks did figure out how to work within the laws of nature so that Greg and I will be able to fly to London. We are also sometimes constrained by others who have imprisoned or oppressed us. And we're constrained by resources and more. But within some limitations that we accept, we choose to believe that we can make choices. Now, that continuum is one way to explain the spectrum of possibilities. There are other words and frameworks that are also used. But this is a sermon, not a textbook. Regardless of the terminology used, usually when free will is discussed, you will also find a discussion of responsibility. My 20 questions book provided this example. Take the case of a criminal who was raised in a slum surrounded by poverty, crime, and drugs. He went to school in which the most academic activity was writing graffiti on the walls. He was abused and beaten as a child, and as a teenager he was beaten. He was harassed as a young adult. His acts of violence, his defense attorney argues, was nothing more but the product of his environment and upbringing. It is society's fault, he says. He, the individual, is not to blame. The prosecutor is incensed, saying that thousands of children grow up in similar circumstances, she argues, and they do not turn to crime. A person is free and responsible for what he or she does, she concludes, and a crime must be paid for. There are many other similar kinds of examples. So which lawyer is right? Certainly, we are heavily influenced by our culture and environment, especially in our developing years. In my last sermon, I talked about the guy that died by the bear eating him or something, you know, and the narrator, old Indian, saying it was a good death. And I thought, well, that wasn't a good death. But then I thought, maybe if I grew up in that culture, I may have thought about that as a good death. Right? So we're heavily influenced by our culture and our environment. And a world that allows children to grow up in these circumstances that this criminal grew up in, and those kind of difficult circumstances, may bear some responsibility too. But most of us sitting on a jury probably would not let this man go free if the prosecution provided strong evidence that he had committed the crime. We may ask the judge for leniency in the sentence that he was given, and we may attempt to encourage programming in criminal justice institutions which might lead to rehabilitation. But we would probably say he bears some responsibility. We also see children that are given too much in their early years. No one ever says no to them. They have all the choices they can possibly make granted. The outcomes for these children in the real world are not good either. They have to learn, but because they have learned no responsibility. They learned about choice, but not about responsibility. If we choose to adopt a free will philosophy, then for a healthy life for ourselves and others, we must also adopt a philosophy of responsibility as well. Now, here's another caveat to that statement, though. What if a person has some neurosis or mental illness, and though the conscious part of the individual wants to make the right choice, like we were hearing from our young people, that part of us wants to make the right choice, the unconscious neurosis seems to make that negative choice. Is this person responsible? Our legal system does have the possibility of not guilty by reason of insanity. But aren't most murderers mentally ill? Or are they just evil? You know, I did not watch all that Alec Murdaugh trial, but I did see the highlights. And I know the jury came back with a guilty verdict. Although I'm not sure that the evidence was provided, all the evidence to prove guilt. But even thinking that, I was glad to see him go to prison. Greg and I have been watching the Bernie Madoff thing on Netflix, and I was glad to see him go to prison. Yeah, finally. Because they seem to be very bad men. I don't know. In reality, this whole discussion, though, of free will is one for people of privilege. For those who live under suppression or who live in extreme poverty and are trying to figure out whether they will sleep on a cold night or whether they will say the wrong thing and get beaten up by those who have power over them, and more. These folks are not thinking about philosophical questions like this. They don't have the time or energy. They must think about survival. And I just want to lift that up in here while we talk about these big questions. We sit here and contemplate all of this because I realize how privileged I am to be able to write a sermon on something like this. And how privileged you are to be able to sit here and come in here and listen to a sermon on something like this. I became much more interested in choice back in the 1980s. I was attending an educational conference in New Orleans with my then husband, Rev Page, where we were presenting some of our research. And the main speaker for the event was Dr. William Glasser, who was famous for writing a book on reality therapy. His newer research had broad implications for education, and that's why they had him at this education conference. He explained it so well that I knew I had to buy the book that was going to come out later and learn more. At the time, his book was called Control Theory. He later changed it to the more positive sounding Choice Theory. Our library did not have it, and the little bookstore in the mall that Teresa Wynn's parents owned did not have it either, but they ordered it for me. They said, we can get it for you, and they did. As I read through this big book, it was like being in therapy, which I desperately needed because of all the difficulties in my marriage at the time. Although I did not plan to ever leave my marriage, it did help me understand that I had choices, especially about how I thought about some things. There were things going on in my husband's life that I desperately wanted to change. I wanted him to love me, not to be enamored with this young graduate assistant. The book helped me to choose to let go of that desire and focus on other things that would help me have a good life, like my other family members, my research, my teaching, my department chair responsibilities, and my social justice work, and more. I do not remember the specifics of the book, but I remember one passage very well. Dr. Lesson was sharing about a patient that, and I'm going to call her Sue because I don't remember the patient's name. He said that she needed to be able to tell herself this message often, and this was the message. Sue can only control her own life. Her happiness does not depend on what others do, but on what she does. And the sooner she learns this, the happier she will be. Well, I changed Sue to Jane and wrote those words on lots of slips of paper. And I taped them all over. I taped them on the mirror in the bathroom, on the refrigerator, on my steering wheel of my car, on my office wall, to remember that. And I would recite it over and over. I still recite it sometimes. Jane can only control her own life. Her happiness depends not on what others do, but on what she does. And the sooner she can learn this, the happier she will be. I learned them and I lived them. And I got so much better. Sadly, as I took more control of my happiness in these ways, my husband just got more and more depressed that he was in a marriage with someone like me. But he didn't believe he should end it. So finally, I was so worried about his depression and his well-being that I decided that I would end it and told him, even though I didn't know what my life would be like, I got married when I was 17, as many of you know. I told him he just needed to go be with her and be happy. She was married, so it took a while for him to get there, but he did, and we were both better off. Are we the masters of our fates? Yes. Are we the captains of our souls? Not completely. But we can get up every day and ask for the serenity to what?
No.
Accept the change. I cannot change. The courage to change the things that I can't. And the wisdom to know the difference. May it be so.